Bob is, to me, one of the key developers of adventure games. He worked at Infocom first, during the late years of Infocom, developing Sherlock Holmes and Arthur, two really slick text adventures. And he then went to found Legend Entertainment, which, as I see it, is one of the most consistently good adventure game companies. They did some real quality text adventures first, then graphical adventures like Mission Critical, Blackstone Chronicles, and well, right now Bob is doing a Kickstarter for a brand new text adventure called Thaumistry, and it's doing pretty well, surprisingly well on Kickstarter, and I hope Bob is going to tell us a bit more about that game today. So welcome, Bob. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's great to be here.
So Bob, I mean, we want to talk about everything from the beginning to the end. Would you want to start with your Kickstarter, or do you want to do that for the end? We'll leave that choice up to you.
So sure, the Kickstarter, it's for a brand new, it's a text adventure game that I've been working on. It's called Thaumistry in Charm's Way. And it's a classic all text adventure game, no graphics at all. And I've really enjoyed working on it. It's a comedy game in the vein really of kind of Eric the Unready, except it's a modern game set in New York City, and it's kind of a cross between Eric the Unready and Spellcasting 101 in that you use spells in order to solve puzzles and do stuff. So that's the short version. It's you can go to Kickstarter page and find us there, find me there.
So I'm just curious, is the spell casting aspect of it like similar to spell casting games or the early Infocom, like Enchanter, stuff like that? The mechanics of it?
Very much so. You've got a spell book. You come across spells. As soon as the spell's in your spell book, you can use it, and you can. There are several ways to use it. You can cast so-and-so spell on somebody, or cast so-and-so spell just into the air, or just say the name of the spell. So different spells work different ways, and it's pretty clear how they work. Hopefully to great comic effect is the goal.
Well, I want to echo something that Augustine said before, which is I'm on record actually in a previous hangout with Josh Mandel as saying that I think Legend Entertainment was the best developer of all time.
Oh man,
and Josh agreed with me, by the way.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
So I think this Kickstarter has sort of been, I would say, teased for some time. It's been a year or so at least where there's been sort of a hint that something is coming potentially in the future. And I'll say I was pretty excited by that personally. I'm sure a lot of people were, because I think not only you made some great games, but probably I think Legend in general, and probably you specifically, are sort of underrated. Like, people nowadays may not have heard of some of the games, or some of them are older or whatnot. Like TimeQuest, for example, is one of my favorite games. I think a lot of people haven't heard of it, doesn't get the appreciation it deserves. So a new game we heard was coming out. Obviously, people were excited. But what made you decide to all of a sudden create a new text adventure in 2017?
Well, I didn't decide in 2017. I decided in 2005. So I was. I remember specifically. In fact, I have my notes on it. I was on an airplane going out to Los Angeles, and for a client, and I was thinking, Legend is shut down, and here I am. I'm working for different clients, and that's fun, but what's the most fun I've ever had, in this industry? Well, it's writing and coding and designing Eric the Unready. And so I thought to myself, oh, I should do that again. And so then that became sort of this huge task. It's like, all right, well, how do you do that? So I started looking around for an adventure game development engine. And of course, the two big ones at the time were Inform and TADS, although there were, Hugo and Adrift and others. So I looked at those systems, and I figured that TADS was the one that was the most most flexible in terms of what I could do as a coder. And so I set about learning TADs, and I went through line by line to build their sample game, and I corresponded with Eric Eve and said, hey, you've got this line in your code, and it doesn't seem to work. And he would write back and say, oh yeah, that's a bug. Thanks, I'll fix that. And so there was a very long period of time when I was learning the development engine, and then I went to work for Zynga, and I worked for Zynga for 3 years, and everything kind of ground to a halt while I was working for Zynga because that was an all-consuming job. And then when I left Zynga, I was like, yes, I want to get back to doing this. And so it's really been in the last 2 years that the gears have really spun up, and that I've really gotten to the point where I could know that I could do it and do a good job at it. So you say it was teased a while ago, and the reason it was teased, where I just said, there might be something coming, is because on Kickstarter there, and in general, there have been cases where people have said that they can do things and they turned out not to be able to do them. And I wanted to make sure before I went public that I could really do this thing. And so that's why it wasn't until I ran an alpha test last May. People played the game, they liked it. I fixed a bunch of stuff since then. And so now I'm fairly confident that I can get this thing done. But to wind all the way back to your original question, why? It's part of it is because I enjoyed it so much myself. It was a fun thing to do. And then another part of it is that and I say this in some of the Kickstarter verbiage, there's stuff that was lost when we went away from parser games. There's a particular kind of interaction, a particular kind of, particular way of playing games that's gone. And it shouldn't be gone. And so that was a big deal to me, to bring back that open-ended sense that not only could you try anything you wanted to in a parser-driven game within reason, but that you had that sense of it's you and the designer. It's like this one-on-one relationship where it's like, I'm the guy in the box, and you're talking to me and I'm talking to you, and you try stuff that you think that nobody would ever think of, and I handle it, and you go, wow, this guy thinks like me. And so that connection is totally gone in our business, where with teams of 150 people, you never feel like you're playing the game with the guy who made it. And so those are some of the things that were in my mind as I made that decision. So really long-winded answer to a really short question.
Good answer, though.
I love it, yeah.
So I'm curious, most of your games had graphics, though, like Sherlock didn't, obviously. But we have parser games like Eric the Unready, the one you mentioned before, has text parser, and you can play it completely as a text adventure, but also has some graphics. Did you consider at any point trying to add graphics to Thaumistry?
Oh yeah, I thought about it, but again, this was considered that this was, first of all, to be a one-man project, and so that was my one of the sort of razors that I used to figure out what features would be in and what wouldn't, what the scope of the game would be. And I can't draw, so I knew I could design, I knew I could write, I knew I could code, but I also knew that I couldn't draw. And so so the addition of graphics to any game just expands the scope enormously, expands the expense enormously. That would mean instead of me spending my time, suddenly I'm hiring people to do stuff in a very speculative way. And it was just something that I decided along the way. I'm not going to do that. And not only am I not going to do it, I'm not going to do it at all. So I'm not even going to put in, static scenes or chapter breaks or things like that. The game doesn't really lend itself to chapter breaks. If it did, I might have considered that, but really it's a much more, Eric was, and some other games are, you do something and then there's a break and then you do something else and then there's a defined, sort of chapters almost. And in this game, that's not the case.
So here's a copy of Sherlock, which is I think your first game, right?
Yes, it was.
So Infocom obviously didn't have the graphics at the beginning, but they had like these little tchotchkes that they would put in. Here's the key fob from Sherlock, right? The idea was to get you involved. I'm not sure how much the key fob gets you really involved in the game world, but I guess you could put on your luggage or something, or your key ring. But have you considered if you get enough interest or there's enough funding to do some kind of physical release of this with some nice feelies and stuff?
So the thing, again, this kind of gets to scope. One thing that's sunk a lot of Kickstarters and developers is that they don't understand or haven't understood the cost and the effort that goes into doing those things. In fact, I just put a little note up on the Kickstarter page in the frequently asked questions, which is, why aren't you doing feelies, or will you do feelies? And the answer was, I used to be in that business. I know exactly how much it costs to do a box and to do a manual and to do, a map and a feelie and all that, and how much it costs to ship it, and the number of subcontractors that you need, and the number of fulfillment companies that you need and stuff. And so I've done all that stuff. I know what it takes to do that. And, basically my interest is in making the game. And so I'm not looking to start, I'm not looking to start Legend Entertainment all over again.
What was it like working at Infocom back in those days? I've seen a lot of documentaries and interviews with folks, and it seems like it's like the wild, wild west of computer game creating back then, where you pretty much just explore and do anything. Was it fun working for Infocom? Were they as fun as they seemed to be?
Bob didn't really work at Infocom, right? You were like a freelancer, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So first of all, yeah, it was as fun as it seemed, and in fact more. So yeah, and point of clarification. So I was actually an outside developer. I was Infocom's only outside developer. I lived in Virginia. I made my games in Virginia. They were located just outside of Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so I would make my games. We would do the coding on a Deck 20 mainframe and ship it up to Infocom on over a 300 baud modem. And every month or so, I would get on a plane and go up to Cambridge, and those were great times. Those guys, people talk about the character of the company and the spirit of the company, and it's exactly right. It's exactly true. I remember going into what they called the Imps Lounge, and it was a sort of a common area with games set up and game boards and all sorts of stuff. And then each of the imps had their own office that was like in a spoken wheel off of this hub. And so, they would come out and they would talk, or they'd go inside and close their door or whatever. But it was clearly kind of, each of them was making their own game, but all of them were working on it, and if that makes any kind of sense. And so I would go up, for example, and every Thursday they had their Imps lunch, and I always made sure to be there on a Thursday because they were very kind to me, because they sort of accepted me. And so we'd go in, and over pizza, one guy would say, "Oh, well, I'm designing this puzzle and I'm having this problem and I don't really know what to do." And then people would come up with ideas, and then you'd go, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. So let's do that." And so there was a really strong sense of camaraderie. There was a really strong sense of, we are going to have fun. They did, their crab races. They did their events. They did all sorts of just bizarre things. They were an intensely social group. which is strange when you think about how introverted most coders and really designers and writers really are. But they it was a magical company, and I've never seen anything like it since. It was great to be a part of that.
I read somewhere that when you started up, you were trying to actually compete against Infocom. Is that correct?
That's absolutely accurate. Hang on a second. Let me turn off email notifications so you don't hear dings as I'm talking. Yeah, absolutely. I started a company, and it was called Challenge. And the idea of a challenge game was, if you think an Infocom game is hard, wait until you play a challenge game. And of course, that was exactly the wrong idea at exactly the wrong time. It's right when Infocom was realizing that people weren't finishing their games, that their games were too hard, and so that they were creating stuff that people weren't getting to the end of. And so quickly, I learned that that was, in fact, the wrong idea. And so I did start Challenge to compete with Infocom, but after they offered me the chance to do development for them, then that was great, and I learned a whole lot from those guys.
What was your background before that you felt you could compete against Infocom?
So I was a writer, and I was, the way I got into the business is I was working on a novel, and I was 2 years into a novel, and an agent came to me and said, or I went to him, the agent didn't come to me, and said, oh, this is an interesting novel. I think I can get you a $20,000 advance for this novel. And so today I understand that that was a huge deal. But at the time I was going, $20,000, I'm 2 years in already. It's probably going to take me another year or two to finish. So that's like $5,000 to $7,000 a year. I can't live on that. And so I had needed to start looking around for a way that I could make a living as a writer without going up against the sort of big barrier entry of literary New York City. And right at that time, my dad, who was a computer guy from going back to when they filled entire rooms, he was into microcomputers, and he had a TRS-80 that he was going to get rid of. And he said, well, instead of getting rid of it, I'll give it to you, and you can use it as a word processor. And so to write your book on. And so I started to do that, but on that computer was Zork. And so I started to play Zork, and I said, oh man, I think I could do that. And so that's sort of the background. I came from a game playing family, from a very puzzle-oriented family. We did a lot of crossword puzzles. We did, a lot of those sorts of things that were a lot of fun. And so I thought, I could do it. But I knew that I had to hire coders to do it because I wasn't a programmer.
And you are now?
So I can code game logic, I think is probably the best way to say that. So I taught myself C. So first of all, the Infocom games were done in ZIL, which is a Lisp-like language. So I learned that sort of. And then when at Legend, we started to, we did our games in C. And so I learned enough C that I could code the puzzles in the game. I couldn't, draw a line on a screen. I couldn't, build any sort of communications device or anything like that, but I could code game logic. And that's still the case today. And that's one of the reasons why I like TADS, is because it lets you change things all the way down. It's all open source, and you can go all the way down into the parser and rewrite whatever you want. And so that's, so I wouldn't call myself a programmer, but I can code game logic and do a little bit more.
Cool. Well, props on the TRS-80. I used to have a TRS-80 Model 1 back in the day. I know Joel had a Coco, so we got some TRS-80 fans over here.
Yeah, we were Coco kids, but I was talking to my dad today about the fact that the Coco never really caught on for some reason. But I had Zork 1, 2, and 3 on the Coco. That's where I got my text adventure fix from back then.
So
yeah, this was a TRS-80. It was a Model 2, I think, dual floppy. There you go.
Model 2 had the
Fancy.
8-inch floppies, right?
No, these were 5 1/4.
I was maybe it was Model 4. Anyway, it would make a difference. I had a Model 1, then 3, then 4, but I never had a 2. But anyway.
I could be wrong about the model number. I know it was dual floppy, and I know they were 5 1/4 because I've never worked with 8-inch floppies.
Gotcha. So after Sherlock, you made this game, right, Arthur?
Yep.
Which is a really good game. I enjoyed it a lot. And this was one of the only Infocom games that have graphics in it. So you did have to work with graphics at some point in the Infocom times. Was that like Infocom people that did it, or was it people working for Challenge that did it? How did that work?
So the competition at the time was Sierra and King's Quest, and LucasArts had started up and was, and the point and click was a big thing, and Infocom, after resisting graphics for so many years, knew that they had to add graphics, and so the impetus came from them, and the artists that worked on the game were in their employ. They were not employed by Challenge, so they were by and large Boston-based artists that I worked with. And a point of irony, that game Arthur was actually Macworld's graphic game of the year, which is like the funniest thing ever. That that an Infocom text adventure won the graphic game of the year award from Macworld. But yeah, Infocom knew, and Legend knew when we started Legend, that we could not put out pure text adventures in a in that market.
So I think I remember hearing at one point that there was another text adventure for Infocom that was partially started, or there's a concept that got canceled. Is that accurate, or am I misremembering?
No, that's right. The Challenge, my company, had a 3-game deal with Infocom, and the idea was that I was going to do the Immortal Legends. So I did Sherlock Holmes and then King Arthur, and the 3rd game in the series was going to be a Robin Hood game. And the idea was each of those characters come with a rich background of an interesting places like Arthurian England with the Knights of the Round Table, and interesting characters like with Merlin and Sir Lancelot and Guinevere and Mordred. And Sherlock Holmes comes with Inspector Lestrade and Watson and the Baker Street of Regulars and Mrs. Hudson and all like that. And Robin Hood comes with Little John and Sheriff of Nottingham and Friar Tuck, and so all of these were what I think about a lot when I do games, which is interesting people in interesting places doing interesting things. And if you can make that happen, then you have a chance of making a good game. And for those titles, 2 of the 3 things were already handled, so I didn't have to create some new character out of whole cloth, and I didn't have to create this environment out of whole cloth. A lot of that had already been created and already been given to me, and they were in the public domain, so no royalties. So part business decision, part marketing decision. Obviously, people know these characters and these worlds, and then part of it is personal interest. I had the annotated Sherlock Holmes biography. I have a shelf full of Sherlock Holmes stuff, and had read all of the Crystal Cave and Once and Future King, and so these were things that I was a fan of. So it was fun for me. But again, it was a mix of personal and business. But yeah, there was a 3rd game that was a Robin Hood game, and they decided not to do that. Instead, I worked on a game that got canceled, which was called The Abyss, which was a movie that James Cameron was making. And I actually started work on that, went down and met with him in Gaffney, South Carolina, where they were filming the Abyss in an abandoned nuclear facility where there's this big containment shell that he could flood and shoot underwater scenes. So that was kind of interesting. But that when Infocom shut down, that game got canceled as well.
Did anything survive from that game?
Apparently it has. I don't have anything. Well, actually, I say that. I don't know what I have to some extent because I have all manner of floppy disks and stuff. And that game, I'm pretty sure we had started to develop in Virginia on a Macintosh. And I'm sure I have those Mac disks. And I don't know if they're readable or whatever. But then not too long ago, somebody discovered a tape, a backup tape, I guess, or a disk from Infocom's mainframe. And apparently there's quite a few design documents and maybe even something playable. I'm not sure, but there's some remnants of that design that are kicking around someplace.
You should just put those Macintosh discs up on eBay and say, I don't know what's on it. It could be nothing, but probably some people will buy it. That's not there.
Some people, Stuart will buy it.
No, I would have. If I wanted to buy it, I wouldn't suggest putting it on eBay. That's a mistake.
Yeah, no, they. My wife is desperate for somebody to come into our house and say whether this stuff is worth keeping or not. It's funny because a few folks have come by, documentary type guys, and so I just start going into closets and pulling out stuff, and they say, "Oh, you have a original signed script of The Abyss from Cameron. That's probably worth something, or you've got this or you've got that." And I'm like, oh, okay. I tend to put things in boxes, and I don't look back a whole lot, despite despite the fact that I'm doing a text adventure these days. But I don't sit around. I don't think a lot about those days. I tend to look forward rather than looking backward. And so I just kind of accumulate stuff and shove it in a closet, and then, figure someday something will happen.
So when Infocom shut down, you basically, I told you, did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I want to say that there definitely are people out there who are interested in coming by and scanning the discs and finding the thing. Like old Mac discs are like not even readable in the later Mac computers floppies. So but there are people who know how to do it.
Jason Scott.
Jason Scott is one of them, but there are quite a few other people. Jason Scott, in fact, put up that whole Infocom thing online, all of Steve Meretsky's Infocom stuff online, the Infocom closet, which is great. Tons of stuff there. But yeah, he's not the only one. He is one of the people, but there are definitely people. So hold on to them, please, 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 please don't throw those things out.
Yeah, speaking of Steve Meretsky, I was about to say is Bob started Legend Entertainment like out of the ashes of Infocom, quote unquote. Managed to take Steve with him, which was a good score. But you co-founded Legend with a guy named Mike Verdue, correct?
Yeah.
How did you meet this guy? Like, who is he? How did he get involved in this? I'm curious.
So, when I started Challenge, I said I could write, I could design, I couldn't code. And so I needed people who could program the games that I wanted to make. And so I went to the Yellow Pages, which is something that you guys are possibly even too young to know what they are. But a great big book that lists companies that do things. And in the Yellow Pages, I found a programming for services, programming for hire services firm. It was called Paragon. And it was started by a guy named Mike Verdue, who I didn't know, and he had dropped out of college to start this company where he had a stable of programmers who he would hire out to different companies to get stuff done for those companies. And so I called him up, and we talked, and he said he had two guys that he thought could help. And so I contracted with him for the services of Mark Pesch and Dwayne Beck, and Dwayne and Mark are the ones who learned Zill and who coded Sherlock and Arthur. So when Infocom shut down, I called Mike and said, basically, the gig is up. Sorry, you know, I can't hire these guys, you know, contract for these guys anymore because I have no business. And he said, well, you know, maybe we should look at this. And so we got together and decided that there was probably still a market for this kind of game. And he and I got together and convinced, by that time he had sold his company to a larger company, and he convinced that company to back us in the starting of Legend Entertainment. And so that's how that came about. And it started where I was kind of the design guy, and we had Steve in as another designer. Although Steve was never an employee, he was up in Boston, and so we had the same kind of relationship that I had with Infocom. And so I was kind of the product guy, and Mike was kind of the biz guy. And that's how things were until we realized that Mike actually was secretly very interested in the games himself and ended up designing them as well, and then went on to a very illustrious career in the games industry. He's currently president of Kabam right now. So he's done really well. But that's how I knew him, is by hiring Mark and Dwayne.
Awesome. So I'm curious, you mentioned before that, you know, your deal with Infocom was like, well, basically licensed stuff, or not licensed, but not original works, because it wasn't licensed, it was public domain. And Legend was really known for primarily doing a lot of stuff based on famous, you know, books and characters and movies, stuff like that. Although the two games that I'm most familiar from you from Legend, this one here that I mentioned before, and this other one here that you mentioned before, those are both original characters, right? Original designs that you came up with. So I'm curious, what was your inspiration for this? Was it just like something that came out of your head, or was there any other story behind those two games in terms of how they came about? If you remember.
Yeah. So TimeQuest was, Infocom had died, and people, and they had moved away from complicated games and were really focusing on doing easier games. And I wondered if they had, in their last games, kind of lost their way a little bit. And I wanted to know if there was still a market for time, and this is TimeQuest I'm talking about now. I wanted to know if there was a market for a really intricate, classic, puzzle-driven game. So it wasn't a comedy. It wasn't a fantasy. But it was, time travel is interesting and allows for interesting puzzles, and the idea that you can do something in one year that will change something in a future year, and that sort of thing, and be able to go back and forth between those places. So so that was that game sprung out of a desire to do a really classic puzzle-driven adventure game. Eric was different. So TimeQuest was kind of calculated. Eric is the only game I've ever done that sort of just came to me out of the blue. I was walking down a beach in South Carolina and on vacation, and suddenly this name popped into my head, Eric the Unready. Now, I was, a fan of, I study a lot of English history, and I knew there was a character in English history that I always thought was very interesting. His name is Ethelred the Unready. And I just thought that was a funny name. And it actually means unready, which meant the ill-advised. So it wasn't like he was ill-prepared or something like that. It was that he didn't pay attention to the people around him. So that's Ethelred. But Eric the Unready just sounded funny, and I thought about a kind of a bumbling knight who was thrust into these situations and had this quest to do stuff that nobody thought he could do, and so that idea was born pretty quickly whereas TimeQuest was developed over time much more slowly. And TimeQuest doesn't really have a great central character. It's got a reasonably interesting villain, Zeke S. Vettenmeyer, which is an anagram of Stephen E. Moretsky. But TimeQuest doesn't have that really interesting central character, whereas Eric was, a little more front and center.
Somehow Eric still manages to get the affections of Lorelei the Worthy. I like that name also. She was worthy for some reason, I guess.
Yes. Well, I can tell you exactly where that came from, actually. There was a hair product at the time called L'Oreal, and the slogan for L'Oreal was "I'm worth it." It was, so their TV ads were, some model, saying, "Oh, sure, L'Oreal's a little bit more expensive, but I'm worth it." And my wife, would watch those ads, and she said, "That's what you should use that." So that was her idea.
That's funny. I never knew that one.
I think that's the first time I've ever told anybody that. Nobody's ever asked about that.
So it must have been really difficult, I'm assuming. Now you're not just a game developer and designer, but you're also running the studio at the same time. What was that like?
It was difficult in different ways. It was tough because after Eric, we realized that we couldn't survive as a company just on the output from Steve and me. We needed more designers, and at the time, Mike sort of uncloaked and revealed that he was interested in doing design work, and we had a couple other people who were interested in that as well. And so Gateway, the first Gateway game, was specifically set up to be a training ground for new designers. And so each of 4 people took a segment of Gateway, and the game is partitioned in that way so that each guy could do his own thing. And of course, the fiction of the Gateway universe is that you get in a ship and you go to this planet, some unknown planet, and then you come back and then you go to some other unknown planet. So they were very discrete environments. So it was okay to have sort of different designer voices, on the different planets. And so Mike Verdu did one, and Mike one segment, and Mike went on to co-design Gateway 2, and then later Mission Critical all on his own. So that was really successful. Another designer on Gateway was Glenn Dahlgren, who went on to co-design Gateway 2 with Mike. The two of them did that together. And then Glenn went on to do Deathgate on his own. And then Wheel of Time was absolutely Glenn's baby. And then when we switched over to first-person shooters and did Unreal, Glenn was the design lead on Unreal 2, and then again went on to another, an extended design career with other companies after Legend went away. Michael Lindner was the third designer on Gateway. He went on to do Companions of Xanth, and that was the only other game that he did for us. So we had this idea of doing that, and the fourth designer dropped out, and I ended up doing the fourth segment. So. But for me personally, so I'm on the road selling, I'm meeting with the buyers at Software Etc. and B. Dalton and Electronics Boutique and Egghead and all the chains that have gone away now. So I'd be on the road a lot and was doing a lot more sales and marketing than I wanted to, but it was needed. And so that's why there's this big gap in the period of time when I worked on games from like 1994, I guess, up until 98 with Blackstone. So that all that time was lost to corporate stuff, which was not my favorite thing, but it's what I did.
It was important, and you needed to do it to keep the company going, to get all those other great games out there. And Gateway is another good example of like completely underrated games, in my opinion. Both of them are excellent. And Deathgate, also another amazing game. Glenn Dahlgren, though, wrote some games before he came to Legend, right? I'm assuming you hired him as a no.
Nope. He came. We were his first job out of college. He came to us as a programmer, and with an interest in music, and he did the music, I think, in Eric the Unready. At least some of it. I don't know if he did all of it or not, because we had a lot of music done by Arfing Dog. And so I don't remember which was done by whom, but I know Glenn did at least some music for Eric. But he was very interested in becoming a game designer, and so he did some of the code work on TimeQuest, and then when we started up Gateway, he had his section of Gateway.
This is like any person going to management where you can't contribute individually as much as you'd like to, but at least you get to develop other people. So there's up and down, I guess, up and downside.
Yeah, I always think in any company, you know, people talk about how hard it is to get ahead, but my sense is always that in any company there's always a vacuum that is sucking people upwards, that there's always stuff that needs to be done that isn't getting done, and that if you're the guy who can go and do that thing, then you're going to move up and you're going to kind of be sucked ever higher into the company. It's certainly what happened to me. So yeah, that's what he wanted to do, and it worked out well.
So you mentioned the Blackstone Chronicles. I'm assuming during your research for that game, that's when you met Augustine, when you were looking at insane people and insane asylums, right?
I don't think so. Actually, I think one other guy had his hand up there, like you wanted to say something, and I'm sorry because I don't know all your names, and they're not displaying here. So
it was me. So I just wanted to tag on before we jump to like all the way at the end. Well, actually, it is kind of covered. I want to tag on to the earlier thing about literary inspirations, because apart from the two titles that were mentioned and what spellcasting games and I guess Superhero League of Hoboken, all of the Legends titles are based on books. And how did that idea come to be? And obviously that's, you know, that was the way for Legend going forward. So I assume it was a successful thing. Was it also because of that same thing, like with Sherlock Holmes and Arthur, what you would bring in a familiar world, but also those are not, you know, public domain works anymore. So you're working with actual like sort of bestsellers and stuff. So how did that happen then?
Well, so we were all fans of science fiction and fantasy, and it's tough in the business world to have a brand new product come out and have people have a reason to buy it. So, you know, if you come up with a name, you know, like water by the shore, you know, or six seagulls or something like that, and people say, well, why would I buy? What is that? Why would I do that? Whereas if you come and you say, we're going to do a Shannara game or a Wheel of Time game, then there's a built-in fan base of people who want to do that. And then you've got authors who are willing to promote the product. And so from a business point of view, it makes sense. From a creative point of view, it also makes sense for the exact reason I was talking about. It's hard to come up with a brand new world, a brand new set of characters that are good. And so you're several steps ahead of the game if somebody's done that work for you, and you can piggyback on that and then find a way to do something creative and interesting within the spaces that they've already created. And so we did a lot of that. We ended up doing, I think, we did 7 totally original games, and those were TimeQuest, Eric the Unready, the 3 spellcasting games, Superhero League of Hoboken. So yeah, those 7 were our original creations, and all the rest were licenses of some sort.
A question, Bob. I think we once discussed this, but how likely it is to bring back those games to GOG or Steam, like putting them back on sale? I mean, the adventures that were based on famous adaptations.
So that's complicated. I have tried often to get the rights back to our original titles, the Spellcasting games, Mission Critical, and my 3 games, or 2 of my 3 games, Eric and TimeQuest. Those rights are owned by Atari, which has gone bankrupt. And you'd think that I'd be able to purchase something from a bankrupt company, but I have had no luck with that. The other games are more problematic, even more so, because all of those games are based on licenses, and licenses expire. They all have a date. They grant you, usually, you have a 5-year window in which you can promote and use this game, and then the rights generally return to the author, and then he has the opportunity to, sell the rights to some other company or to have you re-up or something like that. But so not only are the rights to the games themselves living with Atari, but even if I were to go after those, I'd have to go back to the authors and get renewed licenses from them. So that's really why that stuff isn't happening. It's really complicated, and basically Atari has rebuffed my my advances.
So I'm just curious. This is a weird question, probably, but Blackstone Chronicles. Back to that for a second. It seems like almost every copy I've ever seen of that has a copy of Myst inside. It's bundled with Myst. I don't know if you guys have seen that or not, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I always thought it wasn't very fair, but
so that's interesting. I didn't know that, but so the reason for that, I'm going to speculate now. Legend was a publisher. We published our own games. We developed the code. We created the Gold Master. We duplicated that master into tens of thousands of copies. We built the boxes. We put stuff in the boxes. We shrink wrapped those boxes and delivered them on pallets to a distributor who then sent them out to the retail stores of the world. We were not the publisher of Blackstone Chronicles. We developed that for Mindscape. And my guess is that through various mergers and acquisitions and stuff through the late 90s, probably Mindscape ended up with the rights to Myst. And so that would be my guess as to how that may have come about. Certainly the copy I have doesn't have Myst in it, but
because you threw it out, right? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So, but I didn't know that they were doing that, but that's certainly their right to do that. Again, we were developing the game for them. They were a publisher.
Can I ask another one? Just something came to mind. Also, at sort of mid to late 90s, Legend had a bit of an influx from former Sierra employees. You got Laurie and Corey Coles doing Shannara, and I think Josh Mandel did some ghostwriting on that, right, uncredited. And Ken Allen did the music. And then Josh Mandel went on to do Callahan's Crosstime Saloon, one of my favorite Legend games, and favorite games of all time, really. And Ken Allen also did music for that under a pseudonym. So how did that come to be?
So we had known, I knew a lot of the Sierra guys. I knew a lot of the LucasArts guys. We, we're all kind of laborers in the same field, all working on adventure games of one sort or another. And so when we talked about doing Shannara with Terry, Laurie and Corey were very interested in that world, and so I'm trying to think if I don't remember where Sierra was in their life at that time. I don't remember why Corey and Laurie were available, and I don't remember why Josh was available, whether Sierra had shut down or whether they had stopped doing things or whether those guys had just left. I don't remember why they were available, but they were. If Josh did some ghostwriting on Shannara, I don't remember that. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I don't know what Corey and Lori were doing out there in Oakhurst when I wasn't looking over their shoulder. But certainly, and again, they were outside developers, whereas Josh, actually, I talked into coming and being a Legend employee. So Josh came to Virginia and was an employee at Legend. As for the music, I didn't have a lot to do with how music got into our games. And so I can't really talk about how that happened and who did what. And, I don't know if Mike ended up making that arrangement or whether one of our designers who was in love with, the music of one or more different composers. I remember that Michael Lindner, who's the guy I was talking about who did Companions of Xanth, built our music system. I remember struggling with ad-lib and other sound codexes or whatever in that day. So I remember the technical challenges that were there, but I don't remember the, I certainly was not involved in contracting for the music. So I'm the wrong guy to talk to.
So,
as is often the case.
So after a lot of adventure games, Wheel of Time was like an action adventure, and then Legend started doing first-person shooters. I can't find the boxes right now, but I have the jewel cases. You did their mission pack for Unreal 1, and then here's Unreal 2. I mean, I understand the market was changing, but what was it like for you and I guess the company to like shift so dramatically genres? I mean, I would guess it must have been hard to all of a sudden go into first-person shooters.
Yeah, it was. It kind of was and wasn't at the same time. So that move was really spearheaded by Mike and by Glenn. Both of them were fans of first-person shooters. We had some of the people that we brought in were basically world-class Quake players. They were in clans, and so they were really, really good. And so this was an up-and-coming genre, and so that became interesting. And the thing that really kind of pushed us over the edge was we went down, when we were talking with Robert Jordan, we went down to visit him in Charleston, South Carolina, and we talked with him. Our intent was to do an adventure game set in the world of Wheel, in the Wheel of Time universe. And one of his advisors said, adventure games are dead. You don't want to work with these guys. You should work with somebody who wants to, go into a totally different genre. And so that's what he said to us. Meanwhile, near us, not all that far away, less than 50 miles away from us, Tim Sweeney is developing the Unreal Engine in his house. And we hooked up with him, got his code, went off. Glenn built a couple levels, went back to Tim and said, look at what your engine can do. And he was blown away. He said, I can't believe that you were able to do this in my engine. And so he gave us the engine. And so Legend was the only company that I know of that ever did commercial releases without paying Epic a license, because we had we ended up, if you look at the credits for the Unreal 1, the first Unreal game, you'll find that Legend has a credit in there. Our guys wrote a lot of that engine. I shouldn't say a lot. A more than non-trivial portion of that engine. A lot of that stuff was done at Legend. So then we, Wheel of Time was the first game that came out in the Unreal Engine that wasn't an Unreal branded game, and so we had done the add-on packs for the first Unreal game. We had contributed to the engine. We did Wheel of Time in the Unreal Engine, and it really is a first-person shooter. It's just using spells, so it's not a pure adventure game by any means. And so that's how that transition took place. It was really the people at Legend who were doing the work were real fans of this genre, and we had the opportunity to work with a leader in that genre, and so that's the direction that we went in. And so Mike started as the designer of Unreal 2. When he left the company, he turned the reins over as a designer to Glenn, and so it was a funny situation because I was writing Unreal 2. I wrote the game. Glenn was the designer on the game, and I was the president of the company. So that was a kind of a strange little loop of approvals there, you might think. And it was also weird because we were doing that under contract to Epic, and our company ended up being acquired by GT, who also was publishing Epic's, publishing the Unreal games. So we were the developer for Epic, who approved our stuff, but their stuff had to be approved by GT, who owned us and therefore could approve whatever we did. So another very weird sort of little approval cycle.
One of the interesting things about Wheel of Time, and I played that game about the time I was reading the books. It was when I was in college. One of the things I really liked about that game was that you played a strong female lead at a time, especially when strong female leads weren't really a common thing in games, because you played, I can't remember her name, but she was an Aes Sedai, one of the magic users. And it would have probably been a lot easier to, back then anyway, to make a game out of one of the three male leads from the books. So I was wondering, what did that decision come from the book specifically, or did you guys do that on purpose?
I am sure that would have been that was Glenn. That was a designer choice, that this is how he wanted to approach the world, and this is how he wanted to make that game. So that would have been all him.
One game that we didn't mention at all is, like, for me, Legend Entertainment, it's interactive fiction, graphic adventures, first-person shooters, and then there's Star Control 3. How did it even happen? Like, I know there was some kind of a disagreement with the original developer, and Accolade had to find a different company to develop it. So I would like to know a little bit of background for that. And second question, who came with the idea of using the stop motion animation, which is kind of unusual in gaming at all?
So Star Control, again, is another case of sort of a strong fan meeting serendipity. So both Michael Lindner and Mike Verdu were huge fans of Star Control 2. Just love that game. And our distributor, again, we were a publisher, but we needed a distributor, somebody who would send boxes out into the world. And our distributor was Accolade, and we had a great relationship with Accolade. They were a great company to work with. I like the people still hang out with the executives of that company. And so they, and they own Star Control. And so they were looking for somebody to do Star Control. And Mike Verdu was like, ooh, us. And so I'd have to go and look at the credits, but I would be willing to bet that Michael Lindner probably has a lead design credit on that game. I haven't looked. I haven't looked at it in years and years, but he and Mike Verdu were the two real Star Control fans. As for the animation, I have no idea. Again, that's the designers of our games had a lot of leeway in terms of what they could think of and what they could do. And they were really the owners of the games with some limitation. So I had to ride herd a little bit on Steve when he would want to do some things that were a little more outlandish than I wanted. But by and large, whatever the designer wanted to do, if he could figure out a way to do it, we would do it. If it, again, didn't cost too much. If there's something unusual about that animation, my guess is that it probably came from a combination of the desire from Mike and Michael to do something bounded by, in some fashion, budget, would be my guess, because animation is expensive. And so it may be that they found a way to do something that wasn't as expensive, would be my guess. The other possibility, because that was an external game, that could have come from Accolade. But those are questions for those guys.
So speaking of expensive, one game that used full motion video and actually big Hollywood star was Mission Critical.
Yes.
How it went with the Legend overall? Because I assume the budget for that game must have been double the usual budget for any other graphical adventure at the time. Was that something Legend wanted to do, or for me personally, I love FMV games, but this one stands in the whole Legend portfolio as something that really doesn't belong there, if you know what I mean.
So again, Mike was the lead designer on that, and we're in a, this is about probably 1995, somewhere around there. We're in a very competitive environment where we understand that graphics are ruling the world ever, more and more and more and more. And as when games started to come out on CDs, and you had all this space on CDs, the question is, well, what do you do with all that space? And one of the things that companies in that period of time were doing was full motion video. And so, again, in the same way that we went with well-known franchises as a hook, as a way for people to want to buy the game, here was an original title that had no franchise hook to it, and the idea of bringing in a well-known Hollywood actor was something that we wanted to try and see if that would contribute to the success of the game. So that's how that happened.
Aside from your work as studio head at Legend, you've been very active in the IGDA. You were the head of the IGDA, president. I'm not sure of the title, but a couple times. I'm wearing an IGDA T-shirt right now. But not only that, but you also wrote the book on game design, literally, which I have over here. This is Bob's book on game design. So Bob wrote the book on game design. We could say that. And you're still a very regular contributor to the IGDA. I think you're speaking this year on the topic of creating franchise characters at the GDC, if I'm not mistaken. So you can talk, but I was going to ask, like, what is that like? I mean, how are you viewed by others in the industry? I mean, do you like almost like a rock star, a legend to some people, especially new guys coming in?
Yeah, that's so weird. So yeah, I was the chairman of the IGDA twice, and I've done a lot of stuff with them. The talk that I'm doing at GDC this year is actually in the Narrative Summit, so it's not an IGDA related talk. The one I did last year was very much more in tune of that. It was how to lead a creative life, how survive as a creative person in an industry that's a very difficult industry to have a long career in. And so So that talk was very much geared towards some of the ideals and principles of the IGDA and trying to help people have meaningful careers and meaningful jobs for a long time in our business. So yeah, that's something that I think a lot about. How I'm viewed. I mean, you know, there are one of the things we did at the IGDA was to survey. We did a developer survey, and we've done it a few times. And one of the things we learned is that the turnover in our industry is horrific. So people come in, and within 5 years of coming into the industry, half of the people who come in are gone. And so people have this, you know, idea of making games. You know, I'm going to make this wonderful thing. And then they come in and they find that they're, you know, a texture artist who's doing the blades of grass on the 17th level of this, you know, one thing in this one little corner of the world. And that's what they're doing. And that's what they're going to be doing. And suddenly they feel like this cog in this huge machine, and they don't feel any authorship of the game. And so that's part of what that talk was there to address. But so as people come into the business there, you know, and as I work as a consultant with teams, a lot of people have no idea of, you know, anything that's happened other than in the last like 2 or 3 years, you know, and so I'm just a guy, you know, and to other people, it's like, you wrote games for Infocom. That's pretty cool. And then there are all kinds of gradations in between. And so mostly I try to just get along.
Well, it must be nice to come full circle and be making a game, like one-person game again, right? I mean, sort of back to the beginning.
A huge amount of fun, and I know a lot more now than I did then, and I'm capable of more now than I was capable of then, and I have different set of ambitions for a product now than I had then. So, you know, originally when you start out, you want to be published, right? You just want a game, you know. And now, having done lots of games, now for me it's like, okay, why do you want to do this game? What is special about this thing that makes you want to do it? And you have to kind of keep that thing in mind as you're making this entertainment product, which is meant to be enjoyed by, you know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, who knows, of people. But it also has to be something that is satisfying to yourself, because, you know, you're sinking your life and your hours into this product, and there's got to be a reason. So so it's enormous fun, and it's really hard, but it's hard fun or fun hard or something. I don't know. It's I'm really glad that I'm doing it, and I'm really just enormously glad and grateful that the Kickstarter is going in such a way that it looks as if I'm going to be able to complete this game the way I wanted to. So that's just an amazing thing. And this, you know, that basically 30 years on, I think Arthur came out in 80. Well, I started working on Arthur in 86. So, you know, here we are in 2017, 30 years later, and there are enough people who are interested in this style of gameplay and this experience that they're willing to, you know, put down their dollars in order to pay for it.
I think you say something in your book that if you could tell the story that only you could tell, then it's going to be something really special. So I'm expecting great things out of this game.
Yeah, no pressure, right?
No,
Yeah.
there's pressure.
Yeah, no,
but it'll be good.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, thanks so much for coming. We're going to cut the broadcast. I did want to make sure that everyone knew that the Kickstarter is ongoing.
Oh, thank you.
Go over there and give him your support. The world needs more text adventures, folks. So get out there and give him what you can. And Bob, thanks so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. It's great to meet, you know, fans who love this stuff. That's awesome.
Yeah, one last question to lead us out. How do you feel about people who are now collecting the things that you were working on back then? That's what I'm always curious from the game writers and developers, that there's a community of people out there who are actively collecting your work.
I'm surprised by it. Basically, I didn't think that there was anybody outside of my basement who would be interested in this stuff. And that kind of it kind of goes, I guess, a little bit with my personality. I read, for example, I read a lot of books, but I'm not a book collector. I don't treasure first editions. I don't treasure things so much as what's inside of them, the content. And so I kind of don't think down those lines. And that's probably a bad thing, because there are people who do care about this and who want, for whom part of the experience is that physical component to the stuff that we made. And so if this game is successful, it's entirely possible that in the future I'll cycle back to that and make things with a few more physical objects associated with them, but not on this one.
All right, Bob, thanks so much. We're going to cut it there. Everybody, we'll see you on the flip side.